Sareth sat in silence as the weight of Dreven's story settled over him. Like a heavy cloak, the trading station continued its busy rhythms around them, but inside this small chamber time seemed to have stopped. "You asked earlier why I came to find you," Dreven said finally, "and now you understand that my concern was not about the negotiation itself. You wanted me to know what humans truly are." The elder nodded slowly. "Every major power in this galaxy has a story like the one I just told you, and some are classified so deeply that only a handful of beings know the truth, and others have become legends that are whispered in the dark corners of space. Stations across 1,000 worlds." He rose from his chair and walked to the window where starlight painted silver patterns across his age scales. The Krell Empire encountered a human colony ship that refused to surrender when their fleet surrounded it, and the colonists fought for 18 days until a human relief force arrived, and the Krell lost 40 ships to a people who had nothing but determination and improvised weapons. Sareth listened with new understanding. The Syndicate of War tried to enslave a human mining outpost, and the workers organized a resistance that lasted for 2 years, and by the end, the Syndicate had lost so many soldiers that their entire government collapsed from the strain. Dreven turned to face him. The pattern repeats across every region of explored space, and the details change, but the core truth remains the same, and that truth is what keeps humanity safe from conquest, despite their inferior technology and their small territory. "What truth?" Sareth asked, though he already knew the answer. "That humans form bonds which transcend logic and self-preservation," the elder said, "and those bonds make them capable of actions that no rational species would consider." He moved closer to Sareth. "When I asked Captain Park why she risked everything for strangers, she gave me an answer that I have thought about every day for 200 years. "What did she say?" Dreven's voice softened with memory. "She said that where she came from, the measure of a person was not what they would do for themselves, but what they would do for someone who could never repay them. And she said that the children of Kethera Prime needed help, and that was enough." He paused to let the words sink in. I asked her how she could value stranger lives as highly as her own, and she looked at me with those strange human eyes. Why she could value stranger lives as highly as her own, and she looked at me with those strange her own, and she looked at me with those strange human eyes. And she said that empathy was not a calculation. The elder placed his clawed hand on Sarath's shoulder. She told me that humans feel the pain of others as if it were their own, and that gift or curse, depending on how you view, it makes them incapable of walking away when someone needs them. Sareth struggled to comprehend a species that would die for strangers based on nothing more than shared suffering. The galaxy fears humans because they cannot be predicted or controlled or threatened. Dreven continued, and every tool that works against other species fails. Against humanity, because you cannot manipulate beings who do not prioritize their own survival. What happened to Captain Park after she recovered? A rare smile crossed the elder's face. She returned to Earth and lived another 60 years, and she raised 3 children, and she never spoke publicly about what happened on Kethera Prime because she did not consider it remarkable. Not remarkable. Sareth repeated in disbelief. To her, it was simply what anyone would have done. Dreven said, and that perspective is perhaps the most frightening thing about humans, because they genuinely do not understand why other species view their actions as extraordinary. A soft chime interrupted them, and Sarath's data tablet displayed a notification that the human delegation had arrived at the station. "They are here," he said quietly. "Yes," Dreven confirmed. "And now you must decide how you will approach this meeting." The young merchant rose from his chair and straightened his robes. "I will approach them as allies rather than adversaries." Dreven's smile widened. "That is wise, but there is something else you should know before you meet them." "What is that?" "The leader of the human delegation is named Myray Park, and she is the granddaughter of Captain Una Park, and she wears her grandmother's old insignia as a pendant around her neck. Sareth felt a strange sensation in his chest that he could not identify. The universe has a sense of symmetry, Dreven observed, and perhaps this meeting was meant to happen. They walked together through the corridors of the trading station, and Sareth noticed that other species moved aside to let them pass, and many of them glanced at the young merchant. With curiosity, the human delegation waited in a conference room overlooking the main promenade, and Sareth paused outside the door to compose himself. "Remember what I told you," Dreven said, "and remember that the humans you are about to meet carry the same capacity for loyalty and sacrifice that their ancestors demonstrated 200 years ago." Sareth nodded and stepped through the door. 3 humans rose to greet him, and at their center stood a woman with black hair streaked with gray and kind eyes, and a small metal pendant hanging against her chest. "I am Myre Park," she said with a warm smile, "and we are honored to meet with the Vethrani Trade Council." Sareth extended his hand in the human greeting gesture, and Myre's eyes widened slightly in surprise. "My name is Sareth," he said, "and a wise elder taught me that with humans you do not negotiate as strangers." Myre clasped his hand, and her grip was firm and warm. "How did you know to greet me this way?" Sareth glanced back at Dreven, who stood watching from the doorway. "I learned that your species values connection above all else," he said, "and I learned it from someone who witnessed that truth firsthand 200 years ago on a colony called Kethra Prime." Myre's expression shifted, and something deep and powerful moved behind her eyes. "My grandmother rarely spoke of those days," she said quietly, "but she told me once that the Vethrani people had shown her something beautiful about the galaxy." "What did she tell you?" Myre's smile returned brighter than before. "She said that courage is contagious, and that the Vethrani soldiers who fought beside her learned to hope, even when hope seemed foolish. And she said that partnership with species who could learn to hope was worth more than any trade agreement." Sareth felt warmth spread through his cold blood. "Then perhaps we should not discuss trade today," he suggested, "and perhaps we should discuss partnership instead." Myre squeezed his hand before releasing it. "My grandmother would have liked you," she said behind them. Dreven nodded once with satisfaction and turned to leave. His work was done, and a new generation would carry forward the lesson that had taken him 200 years to fully understand. The galaxy feared humans not because of what they could destroy, but because of what they chose to protect, and that choice made them the most valuable allies any species could ever hope to. Finsereth looked at the humans before him and saw not a younger species to be managed, but partners in something greater than any single world or civilization. He saw hope wearing human faces, and he understood at last why that hope was the most powerful force in the universe. Dreven's voice grew heavy as he continued, and the air in the chambers seemed to thicken with the weight of what he was about to describe. Jinho Beak was captured during a supply run between our defensive positions, and the Scorn ambushed his team and killed 2 Vethrani guards before dragging him away. Sareth watched the elder's scales ripple through patterns of grief and rage. The Scorn commander broadcast the capture across all channels because he wanted us to see what would happen to anyone who resisted, and he wanted to break our spirit by showing us the price of defiance. They tortured him," Sareth said quietly. "For 14 hours, Dreven confirmed, and they broadcast every moment of it, and they expected the humans to beg for mercy or offer to surrender in exchange for their friend's life." The old Vethrani's claws dug into the arms of his chair. "I was in the command center when the broadcast began, and I watched Captain Park's face as she saw what they were doing to her crew member, and I expected to see despair or horror or the kind of breaking that happens when hope dies." "What did you see instead?" Dreven was silent for a long moment. "I saw her change," he finally said, "and it was like watching a star collapse into something denser and more dangerous, and the warmth left her eyes and was replaced by something cold and absolute. He shook his head slowly. She turned off the broadcast before it ended, and she gathered her remaining crew, and she spoke to them in their language, and I did not understand the words, but I understood the tone. What was she saying? She was making a promise. Driven said, and I learned later that she told them they would get Jinho back, and they would make the Scorn pay for every wound they had inflicted, and they would not stop until the debt was settled. The elder rose from his chair and moved to the window. The other species in this galaxy believe that humans are soft because they smile and make jokes and form attachments easily. That belief is the most dangerous mistake anyone can make. He turned to face Sareth, because when you hurt someone a human loves, you do not weaken them, and you do not break their spirit, and instead, you transform them into something far more terrifying than any weapon ever built. What did Captain Park do? She planned an assault on the Scorn command ship, Driven said, and when our military advisors told her it was suicide, she agreed with them, and then she asked for volunteers. His scales shifted to a pattern of awe. Every remaining human volunteered immediately, and they did not hesitate for even a moment, and they did not ask about the odds or the plan or the likelihood of survival. How many went? 5 humans, including Captain Park. Driven said, because she needed the others to continue defending the colony, and she chose the 5 who had the best chance of reaching the command ship. He paused, and his voice dropped lower. I volunteered to go with them because I wanted to understand these strange beings who fought like nothing I'd ever seen, and Captain Park accepted my offer after looking at me for a long moment. Sareth leaned forward. You were part of the assault. Yes, the elder confirmed. And what I witnessed that night changed everything I believed about the universe and about the nature of courage. He returned to his chair, but did not sit. We used a maintenance shuttle to approach the command ship, and the Scorn had not expected anyone to be foolish enough to attack their flagship, so their defenses were focused outward on the planet below. You got aboard. We crashed into a cargo bay and fought our way through the corridors, and the Scorn outnumbered. You was 100 to 1, but the humans did not seem to notice. Driven's voice trembled slightly. I watched Captain Park take a blade through her shoulder and keep fighting, and I watched a human named Dohyun hold a doorway against 20 Scorn warriors, while the rest of us moved forward, and I heard him laughing as he fired his weapon. Laughing. Humans laugh when they are afraid, the elder explained. And they laugh when they are in pain, and they laugh when they face impossible odds, because laughter is how they remind themselves that they are still alive and still fighting. He finally lowered himself back into his chair. We found Jinho in a holding cell near the command bridge, and he was barely conscious, and his body was broken in ways I do not wish to describe, but when he saw Captain Park, his eyes cleared and he smiled. Sareth felt his throat tighten. He smiled. Her and he said something in their language, and Park knelt beside him and touched his face, and for just a moment, I saw the warmth return to her eyes. What did he say? He said he knew she would come. Driven said, and he said he never doubted for a single moment because that is what humans do for their own. The elder's voice grew stronger. We carried Jinho with us as we pushed toward the command bridge, and Park had taken 11 wounds by then, and she was bleeding from cuts and burns across her entire body, but she would not stop. 11 wounds. I counted them later. Driven said, and any one of them would have been enough to stop a Vethrani soldier, but she kept moving until her legs physically would not carry her anymore. He leaned forward with intensity. When we reached the command bridge, the Scorn commander was waiting with his personal guard, and he looked at our small bloody group, and he laughed because he thought he had already won. But he was wrong. The humans did not come to win. Driven said, and they came to send a message, and that message was delivered when Captain Park used the last of her strength to trigger the explosives she had planted throughout the ship during our assault. Sarath's eyes widened. She destroyed the command ship. She destroyed the commander and his senior officers and the entire command structure of the Scorn fleet. The Elder confirmed, and the explosion was visible from the planet's surface, and the Scorn warriors saw their flagship die, and they felt something they had never experienced before. Fear. Terror. Driven corrected, because they realized that the humans had never intended to survive the assault, and they had accepted death from the moment they launched their shuttle. And nothing the Scorn could threaten would stop beings who had already decided to die. He sat back in his chair. The Scorn fleet fell into chaos without their commander, and by the time a Vethrani military patrol arrived the next day, the remaining Scorn ships were already retreating. Captain Park died in the explosion. No, Driven said, and that is perhaps the most remarkable part of the story, because one of the other humans dragged her to an escape pod before the ship was destroyed, and they ejected seconds before the detonation. His scale shifted to wonder. She survived with wounds that should have killed her 3 times over, and she spent 8 months recovering at a Vethrani medical facility. And when she finally woke up, the first thing she asked was whether the children were safe. Sareth sat in stunned silence. That is who humans are, Driven said, and that is why every species in this galaxy learned to fear them, and not because they are strong or advanced or numerous. He fixed Sareth with his ancient gaze. They fear humans because you cannot defeat an enemy who has decided that your survival matters more than their own. Sareth followed Driven back to the private chamber where the strange lesson had begun, and the Elder lowered himself into his chair with a heavy sigh. Weight of memory seemed to press down on his ancient shoulders as he continued his story. The first thing Captain Park did was divide her crew into teams and assign each team to a different sector of the colony, and she put a human in charge of every major defensive position, even though we had Vethrani soldiers who outranked them in every official way. Your people accepted this? Sareth asked. We had no choice, Driven admitted, because the humans had something we lacked, and at first I thought it was simply confidence, but I came to understand it was something far stranger. He leaned back in his chair, and his eyes grew distant. The humans called it adaptability, and they used this word constantly during those 3 days, and I watched them look at problems that our engineers had declared impossible and solve them in ways that made no logical sense. Can you give me an example? Driven nodded slowly. The Scorn had orbital superiority, and they could bombard any position we fortified, and our military advisors said there was no way to establish a defensive perimeter without being destroyed from above. A reasonable assessment. Sareth said, Captain Park listened to our advisors explain why defense was impossible, and then she asked a strange question, and she wanted to know if we had any underground mining tunnels. The Elder's scale shifted with what might have been amusement. When we told her about the old excavation network beneath the colony, she spent 2 hours crawling through those tunnels with a datapad, and when she emerged, she was covered in dust and grinning like a predator. What had she found? Nothing, Driven said, but she had imagined something, and that was the difference between humans and every other species I have ever known. He rose from his chair and began pacing the small room. She had imagined using the tunnels not for hiding, but for attacking, and she proposed that we modify our few defensive weapons to be portable and move them through the underground network and strike it. Scorn landing parties from unexpected directions and then disappear before they could respond. Guerrilla warfare, Sareth said, recognizing the concept from his studies. Yes, but it was more than tactics, Driven replied, because the humans did not simply fight from the tunnels, and they also spread false information, and they planted decoys, and they made the Scorn believe we had 10 times as many fighters as we actually possessed. The old Vethrani stopped pacing and faced his young student. I watched a human named Tazung spend 6 hours building a device from spare parts that projected holographic images of weapon emplacements, and the Scorn wasted an entire day bombarding empty hills while our real positions remained hidden. Deception. Sareth said. Deception and improvisation and a complete disregard for the proper way of doing things. Dreven agreed. And I remember asking Captain Park why humans fought this way, and she laughed and told me that her species had spent thousands of years fighting each other before they ever reached the stars. His voice dropped lower. She said that humans had learned war the hard way, and that every dirty trick and desperate gamble and impossible stratagem had been invented by humans fighting. Other humans in the Scorn had no idea what they were walking into. Sareth felt a chill run down his spine despite his cold blood. The first Scorn assault came 12 hours after the blockade began, and they sent 2,000 warriors to capture what they believed was a defenseless colony. Dreven's scales darkened with remembered fury. Captain Park had positioned her people at key choke points throughout the settlement, and she had armed every Vethrani civilian who could hold a weapon, and she had turned our homes and shops into death traps. How many Scorn did you kill? 300 in the first wave, Dreven said. And we lost only 12 Vethrani because the humans had taught us to retreat before we could be overwhelmed and to regroup in the tunnels and to strike again from a different direction. The elder returned to his chair and his breathing had become labored from the emotion of remembering. The Scorn commander was furious, and he sent a larger force the next day, and this time they brought heavy weapons and air support, and they expected to crush us completely. But they failed. Again, they took ground, Dreven admitted, and they pushed us back into the central district, and they killed Vethrani soldiers who stood their ground too long, but they paid for every street with Scorn blood. He closed his eyes. I fought beside a human named Minji during the second assault, and she was young and small, and she looked like she should have been studying at a university instead of carrying a rifle through burning streets. What happened to her? She took a plasma bolt to her left arm during a retreat, and the wound should have been crippling, and any Vethrani would have fallen back to receive medical treatment. Dreven opened his eyes, and Sareth saw something like wonder in them. Minji wrapped her arm in a piece of cloth and kept fighting for another 6 hours, and when I asked her how she was still standing, she told me that her body could rest after the children were safe. The young merchant struggled to comprehend what he was hearing. Humans have a chemical in their bodies called adrenaline, Dreven explained, and it allows them to ignore pain and push past exhaustion in ways that seem impossible to other species. And they can function without sleep for days, if they believe the cause is important enough. That sounds like a biological advantage. It is more than biology, the elder insisted, because the adrenaline only works when the human believes in what they are fighting for, and I watched humans who could barely stand upright charge into Scorn positions because they had decided that surrender was not an option. He leaned forward with intensity. By the end of the second day, the Scorn commander realized he was facing something he had never encountered before, and his warriors were becoming afraid. And fear is not something the Scorn were bred to feel. What changed? The humans started singing, Dreven said, and at first I thought they had lost their minds, because what creature sings during a battle? His scales shifted to a pattern of deep unease. But then I understood what they were doing, and they were not singing for joy, and they were singing to remind themselves why they were fighting, and the sound of human voices raised together in those dark tunnels was the most terrifying thing the Scorn had ever heard. The elder's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, because it meant the humans were not breaking, and it meant they would not stop, and it meant that the Scorn would have to kill every single one of them to end the resistance. He looked directly at Sareth, and that was when the Scorn commander made his terrible mistake and decided to capture a human alive and make an example of them. What happened? Sareth asked, though part of him did not want to know. They took a man named Jinho, Dreven said, and what came next would haunt the Scorn for the rest of their existence. Driven led Sereth through the winding corridors of the trading station until they reached a private observation deck overlooking the endless stars. The old Vethrani settled onto a bench designed for multiple species and gestured for the young merchant to join him beyond. The transparent walls, the galaxy stretched out in brilliant patterns of light and darkness. 200 years ago, Driven began. I was stationed on Kithura Prime as part of a small security force, and our job was simple because the colony was peaceful and far from any conflict zones. And we spent most of our time settling minor disputes between farmers and merchants. Sereth listened carefully and tried to imagine the elder as a young soldier. The colony had been established for 3 generations, and our people had built homes and schools and markets. And we thought of ourselves as permanent residents of that world, and we raised our children there and buried our dead in its soil. Driven's voice carried a weight that made the air feel heavy. When the Scorn fleet appeared in our sky, everything changed in a single moment, and I remember standing in the main plaza and watching those massive warships descend through the clouds and knowing that our peaceful existence was over. How many ships? Sereth asked. 47 combat vessels and 12 troop carriers. Driven replied. And each of those carriers held 5,000 Scorn warriors, bred for conquest and violence. And we had perhaps 200 security personnel with outdated weapons. The young merchant felt cold, despite the regulated temperature of the station. The Scorn commander broadcast his demands across every communication channel on the planet, and he gave us 3 days to surrender unconditionally or face complete annihilation, and he made it clear that surrender meant slavery for the adults and something worse for the children. Driven paused, and his scales shifted to a muted gray pattern of grief. The Scorn were known throughout the galaxy for their cruelty, and their empire was built on the bones of conquered species, and we knew what awaited us if we surrendered. But you had no way to fight back. Sereth said. No, the elder agreed. And our leaders began debating the terms of our surrender, because even slavery was preferable to extinction, and at least some of our people might survive to be rescued someday. He turned to look at Sereth directly, and then the humans arrived. A military force. Sereth asked hopefully Dramite and let out a sound that might have been a bitter laugh. A single freighter called the Wandering Star, with a crew of 12 humans who had stopped at our colony for engine repairs, and they were merchants and traders. With no military training and no weapons beyond personal sidearms, and they could have left at any time because the Scorn blockade was focused on preventing escape from the planet's surface, and a ship already in orbit could have slipped away easily. Why did they stay? The old Vethrani's eyes grew distant, as if he were seeing events from 2 centuries ago play out before him once more. Their captain was a woman named Una Park, and she was perhaps 40 years old, with gray streaking her black hair. And she had a scar across her left cheek from some past adventure, and when she walked into our command center, she carried herself like someone who had never been afraid of anything. Driven smiled faintly at the memory. Our governor explained the situation and thanked the humans for their visit and told them they should leave immediately before the Scorn noticed their ship and Captain Park. Listened to everything without interrupting, and when the governor finished speaking, she asked only one question. What question? Sereth pressed. She asked if there were children on the colony. The words hung in the air between them. When the governor told her about the 12,000 children, Park turned to her crew and spoke to them in their own language, and I could not understand the words, but I watched their faces change, and I saw something pass between them that I did not recognize at the time. Driven shook his head slowly. Later I learned the humans have a word for it, and they call it resolve, and it is something that settles into their bones when they have decided on a course of action, and nothing in the universe can shake it loose. What did she do? Sereth asked. She told the governor that her crew would not be leaving, and he tried to explain that 12 humans could not possibly make a difference against the Scorn Armada, and that their sacrifice would be meaningless, and that they should save themselves while they still could. The elder's scales rippled with an emotion Sarath could not identify. Captain Park looked at our governor with those strange round human eyes, and she said something that I have never forgotten in 200 years. What did she say? She said that where she came from people did not abandon children to monsters, and she said that her crew had voted and the decision was unanimous. And she said that they would stand with us until the end, whatever that end might be. Dreven rose from the bench and walked closer to the observation window. The governor argued with her for an hour, and he begged her to be reasonable. And he explained that the Vethrani had no way to repay such a sacrifice and that her death would accomplish nothing. But she would not leave. Sarah said quietly, "No," Dreven confirmed. And when the governor finally gave up and asked what she planned to do against 47 warships with a freighter and 12 humans, she smiled at him. The old Vethrani turned back to face his young companion. She said that she was going to send a distress call to every human ship within range, and then she was going to hold the line until help arrived. And when the governor pointed out that no human ships were anywhere close enough to respond, in time she just shrugged. "That seems foolish," Sarath said, "to fight for a hopeless cause." Dreven crossed the distance between them and placed a clawed hand on the young merchant's shoulder. "That is what I thought too at the time, and that is what every Vethrani on that colony thought, and we believed the humans were either insane or too stupid to understand their situation." His grip tightened slightly. "We were wrong, and our failure to understand what we were witnessing nearly cost us the chance to learn the most important lesson the galaxy has ever taught." "What lesson?" Sarath asked. "That hope is not a calculation," Dreven said. "And courage is not a strategy, and sometimes the beings who change history are not the ones with the biggest armies or the most advanced technology, but the ones who simply refuse to accept that some things cannot be done." He released Sarath's shoulder and moved toward the door. Captain Park spent the next 6 hours transforming our colony into a fortress, and she organized civilians into work crews, and she repurposed farming equipment into weapons, and she turned our peaceful home into something that would make the Scorn bleed for every meter of ground they tried to take. The door slid open and Dreven paused, and when the first Scorn landing parties descended from the sky, they expected frightened prey waiting to be collected. His scale shifted to a dark pattern of remembered violence. What they found instead was 12 humans who had decided that 50,000 strangers were worth dying for, and the discovery would change the balance of power in this galaxy forever. Sarath checked his reflection in the polished metal wall of the trading station and adjusted the silver clasp on his merchant robes for the 3rd time that morning. His boast green scales gleamed under the artificial lights, and his vertical pupils narrowed with focus as he reviewed the contract documents on his data tablet. Today would be the day he proved himself to the Vethrani Trade Council. Today, he would secure the mining rights to the outer nebula asteroids by negotiating directly with a human delegation. The young reptilian merchant had spent 6 months preparing for this moment, and he felt confident that his research into human psychology would give him the advantage he needed. Humans were a younger species in the galactic community, with technology that lagged behind most established civilizations by at least 2 centuries. They had only achieved faster than light travel 80 years ago, and their territory consisted of a mere 47 colonized worlds. Sarath saw them as eager newcomers who would be easy to outmaneuver in a trade negotiation. He was reviewing his opening statements when the door to his private chamber slid open without warning. Counselor Dreven stood in the doorway, and his ancient scales had faded to a pale gray green that spoke of his advanced age. The elder Vethrani was over 300 years old and had served on the Trade Council longer than Sarath had been alive. His presence here was unexpected, and his expression was troubling. The old one's scales rippled with a pattern Sarath did not recognize at first. It took him a moment to realize it was fear. "Young merchant," Dreven said in a voice that carried the weight of centuries. "I have learned of your appointment with the human delegation." Sareth bowed his head in respect, but felt annoyance at the interruption. "Yes, Counselor. I am honored to represent our people in these negotiations, and I have prepared extensively for this opportunity." Dreven entered the room, and the door sealed behind him. Moved to the window that overlooked the busy station promenade, where dozens of species went about there. "Daily commerce. Tell me what you know of humans." The elder said, without turning around. Sareth straightened his posture and recited the facts he had memorized. Humans originate from a high-gravity world called Earth in the Sol system, and they are carbon-based mammals with bilateral symmetry. And they communicate primarily through verbal speech and written language, and their average lifespan is approximately 100 standard years, and their technology focuses heavily on adaptability rather than specialization, and they are known for their persistence in negotiations and their unusual attachment to concepts they call honor and loyalty. Dreven let out a long breath that hissed through his teeth. "You know nothing," he said quietly. The words struck Sareth like a physical blow, and his scales flushed darker with embarrassment and anger. "Counselor, I have studied every available document about human culture and trade practices, and I assure you that I am fully prepared to represent Vethrani interests." The old Reptilian finally turned to face him, and Sareth felt his confidence waver when he saw the look in those ancient eyes. It was not merely fear, it was something deeper and older and far more unsettling. "There are documents you have not seen," Dreven said, "because they are classified at the highest levels of our government, and because the Trade Council has decided that some knowledge is too dangerous to spread." Sareth felt his throat tighten. "What kind of knowledge?" Dreven crossed the room and settled his aged body into a chair with obvious effort. His joints cracked, and his breathing was labored, but his gaze remained sharp and unwavering. 200 years ago, I was not a counselor, but a young soldier stationed on a colony world called Kethra Prime, and what happened there changed everything. I thought I knew about the universe. I do not understand what this has to do with my negotiation," Sareth said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Sit down," Dreven commanded, "and I will tell you why every major power in this galaxy has a classified file about humans, and why those files all say the same thing." Sareth found himself obeying without thought, and he lowered himself into the chair across from the elder. Station hummed with activity around them, but the room felt suddenly isolated from the rest of the universe. "The humans you will meet today seem harmless," Dreven began, "and in many ways they are among the friendliest species you will ever encounter, and they smile easily, and they make jokes, and they seem genuinely interested in cooperation and mutual benefit. These sound like positive traits for a negotiation partner." Sareth offered. Revan shook his head slowly. "That is what makes them so dangerous, and that is why the Scorn Dominion no longer exists, and that is why the Krell Empire signed a permanent non-aggression treaty with Earth, and that is why species far older and more powerful than humanity treat them with a respect that borders on reverence." Sareth leaned forward despite himself. The Scorn Dominion collapsed from internal conflict, and the historical records clearly state that their expansion was unsustainable. The historical records available to the public are incomplete, Dreven said, and they were made incomplete on purpose because the truth would cause panic across 100 worlds. The old Vethrani closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, Sareth saw something that looked almost like pain. On Kethra Prime, there were 50,000 Vethrani, civilians including 12,000 children, and when the Scorn fleet arrived to conquer us, we had no military vessels and no weapons capable of fighting back, and we prepared ourselves for enslavement or death. But the colony survived, Sareth said, and I have seen it listed in our territorial records. Yes, Dreven whispered. The colony survived because of 12 humans. Sereth felt his scales shift in confusion. 12 humans against the Scorn Dominion is not possible, and the Scorn conquered entire systems with their war fleets. I know what is possible and what is not, Dreven replied, because I watched it happen with my own eyes, and what I saw taught me that humans do not operate by the same rules as the rest of us. He leaned forward and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. What makes humans terrifying is not what they can do, because their bodies are fragile and their technology is inferior and their lifespans are short. Then what is it? Sereth asked. Revan held his gaze with an intensity that made the young merchant want to look away. What makes humans terrifying is what they choose to do. When someone they have decided to protect is threatened, and it does not matter if they have known that person for years or for 5 minutes, and it does not matter if the odds are impossible, and it does not matter if it means their own death. The elder rose from his chair with difficulty and moved toward the door. Before you meet with those humans, you will hear the full story of Kethra Prime, and then you will understand why I came here today, and why every Vethrani who knows the truth treats humanity not as a younger species to be managed, but as something far more unpredictable and far more dangerous than any weapon ever built. The door slid open, and Dreven paused at the threshold. Come with me, young merchant, and learn what fear really means.